Tonight, breaking news, millions across the Northeast on alert for flooding as a powerful storm barrels up the coast. And U.S. forces in Iraq come under attack again amid growing fears of a wider war in the Middle East. First, the urgent weather warnings. Heavy rain up and down the East Coast tonight, impacting the I-95 corridor. At least 10 million people bracing for possible flooding. The heaviest rain expected overnight in the New York City area. Flood watches issued for several states and in places already saturated from recent heavy rain. Rob Marciano timing it all out. The mid-air emergency, a bird strike shortly after takeoff, forcing a Southwest Airlines plane bound for Austin to instead make an emergency landing in Fort Lauderdale. Gio Benitez with late details. The crisis at the border. Top U.S. officials head to Mexico for major talks with the country's president about slowing the record migrant surge as a caravan of thousands of migrants, some of them families with small children, make their way towards the U.S. border. And tonight, the urgent plea from the mayor of New York City, Mireya Villarreal, reporting. The new fears of a wider war in the Middle East. U.S. troops come under attack again in Iraq. Militants claiming responsibility for the latest drone strikes just days after the U.S. hit targets in Iraq. And the urgent effort to free the hostages still held by Hamas, some of them Americans. President Biden talking with leaders in the region, Terry Moran in Washington and Britt Clennett from Israel. A legal victory for former President Trump. Michigan's highest court rejects an appeal aimed at barring him from the state's Republican primary. What this could mean for similar challenges. Aaron Katersky standing by. The incredible story of survival. A driver pulled from his car, trapped for days after crashing into an Indiana creek. The Good Samaritans who saved his life. A wild and white-knuckle landing. An American Airlines crew battles powerful winds. And the surprise Christmas mess under the tree, and the adorable 3-year-old who is just trying to help.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with David Muir.
Good evening. It's great to have you with us on this Wednesday night. I'm Whit Johnson in for David. And we begin with that breaking news, a dangerous storm system taking aim at the Northeast. Heavy rain expected and an urgent flood threat along the I-95 corridor, impacting more than 10 million Americans from Delaware to Pennsylvania to New Jersey and New York City. Let's get right to ABC's senior meteorologist, Rob Marciano. So, Rob, when is the worst of this storm expected to hit?
I think right around midnight for most of us, Whit. You know, the Northeast as a whole has seen twice the normal amount of rain in the past 30 days, a couple of flooding events, and some of those same spots probably going to see some flooding tonight. Here's the big risk area. All of New Jersey, you've had your fair share. New York City, back through Philadelphia, including Maryland as well. That big Midwest storm is transferring its energy to a coastal low. That will intensify the rains tonight. There it is, Philly to New York, northern Jersey, right around midnight. That's the heavy stuff, lingering around New York Metro through the wee hours. And then early tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., it begins to press off into parts of Connecticut and eastern New England throughout the day. 1 to 3+ inches of rainfall. The bulk of that is going to be coming over the next 12 hours in the dark of night. Whit?
Another round of this heavy rain. Okay, Rob, thank you. Now to the mid-air emergency. A bird strike forcing a Southwest Airlines flight to change course shortly after taking off from Fort Lauderdale. ABC's transportation correspondent Gio Benitez has the late details just coming in.
Southwest Airlines Flight 1460 was bound for Austin this morning when shortly after takeoff from Fort Lauderdale, the call to the tower.
1416, we had a big flock of birds we went through. We may have even hit one there.
The Boeing 737 landed safely just before noon, emergency crews meeting it at the gate. It's the second such incident on a Southwest plane in less than a week.
Do you need an emergency vehicle? We need everything you have.
Last Thursday, Southwest Flight 554, bound for Tampa out of New Orleans, had to turn back after a bird struck the outside of the plane during departure. The FAA says there have been nearly 15,000 bird strikes on planes in the U.S. just this year.
They can be very serious. The airplanes are not built to brush them aside, but engines, I've taken birds in engines, and it can damage the engine. It can cause an engine to fail.
And with this all comes as a record number of travelers are flying for the holiday. The next busiest day to fly is this Friday. That's when we expect another 2.5 million passengers.
Gio Benitez, thank you. We move on now to the crisis at the border and major talks between the U.S. and Mexico. This as a caravan of migrants, around 6,000, is making the treacherous journey to the U.S. southern border. Secretary of State Blinken and Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas are in Mexico City pressing the country's president to do more to slow the surge, as migrant crossings are expected to reach new record highs. ABC's Mireya Villarreal is in Texas tonight.
Tonight, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken departing Mexico City after pressing Mexico's president for help with the migrant surge at the border, joined by DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Sources telling ABC News that the Biden administration planned to push Mexico to step up immigration enforcement within their country, help reopen key ports of entry, and encourage migrants to stay in Mexico. The urgent meeting coming as border officials brace for this caravan of migrants, an estimated 6,000 people pushing through southern Mexico towards an overwhelmed U.S. border. Marvin, a migrant from Honduras, says in our country the situation is getting worse and worse. We are only looking for an opportunity to work. We are not criminals. Their journey, a treacherous one. On Tuesday, officials in Mexico say they located one body in the Rio Grande after two men drowned while trying to cross into the U.S. near Matamoros. December now on track to have the highest number of Border Patrol apprehensions ever, according to CBP data. Several days this month seeing more than 10,000 apprehensions. Republican Texas Governor Greg Abbott using taxpayer dollars to fly hundreds of asylum seekers to Democratic-led sanctuary cities like Chicago and New York, where local police limit their coordination with federal immigration and customs enforcement. Overnight, a plane carrying over 180 migrants from Texas diverted to Philadelphia due to weather issues. The group later packed on buses and transported to New York City. Tonight, Mayor Eric Adams now requiring those buses to provide 32-hour notice before arriving in the city and urging the federal government to step up.
This is a national problem that has only been exacerbated by Governor Abbott's cruel, inhumane politics. The federal government must take responsibility.
Mireya Villarreal joining us now. And Mireya, today we heard the president of Mexico talk about wanting to work with the U.S., but any funding to support those efforts would likely require a deal from Congress.
That's exactly right. The funding would need to come from that border security bill that has yet to be approved. But we do know that bipartisan negotiations, conversations are happening right now remotely over the holiday break. And senators are trying to negotiate some sort of deal. And while there's no guarantee, the hope is that when they return on January 8th, they will have something to present. Whit?
All right, Mireya, thank you. We move overseas now, and growing fears of a widening conflict in the Middle East. An Iranian-backed paramilitary group launched new drone strikes against U.S. forces in Iraq. And it comes just days after the U.S. hit key targets in that country in retaliatory strikes. President Biden facing increasing pressure to deter these threats. ABC's Terry Moran in Washington.
Tonight, renewed concerns of a wider war in the Middle East as Iran-backed rebels launch another drone attack on U.S. forces stationed at Erbil Air Base in northern Iraq. The attack is the latest of the more than 100 incidents where Iranian-backed groups have targeted U.S. troops with rockets and drones since the start of Israel's war against Hamas. Just this week, President Biden directed U.S. forces to carry out multiple retaliatory airstrikes on Iranian-affiliated militia groups in Iraq, who hours earlier launched self-detonating drones that left 3 U.S. service members injured, one critically. In response, Houthi rebels in Yemen, backed by Iran, fired on more commercial vessels in the Red Sea, according to U.S. Central Command. U.S. warships in the region shot down 12 drones and 5 missiles over a 10-hour period.
The United States has pushed forces to the region to try to deter the war in Gaza from expanding. Of course, that also gives our adversaries, especially Iran and their proxies, more targets.
President Biden's calculated response to all these attacks on U.S. forces in the region have so far failed to stop them, raising the stakes in what has become a shadowy showdown with Iran over U.S. support for Israel against Hamas. The dangerous instability seemed to spread farther over the weekend when a chemical tanker was struck by an Iranian drone 200 miles off the coast of India.
Terry Moran back with us now. And Terry, how is the U.S. trying to manage this delicate balancing act as more troops come under attack throughout the region?
Well, the administration is trying to build an international coalition to protect commercial shipping through that crucial Red Sea trade route, while at the same time increasing the use of force against the Iranian-backed militias without triggering that wider war. It's a real challenge, and right now it's clear President Biden would prefer to err on the side of caution. Whit?
Terry, thank you. And the Biden administration is also engaging in the urgent effort to free the hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza, some of them Americans. But Israel now focusing on a new phase of the war, saying it could take months. Here's ABC's Britt Clennett in Israel again tonight.
Tonight, Israel ratcheting up the rhetoric on regional tensions, with the Israeli defense minister saying Israel is under attack on several fronts, including Syria and Lebanon, where the IDF claims to have hit Hezbollah targets. Israel is facing mounting international pressure to secure a deal to free the more than 100 hostages still held by Hamas. President Biden speaking to Qatar's Emir, the two leaders discussing the urgent effort to release all remaining hostages, including American citizens, and the need to boost humanitarian aid to Gaza. Overnight, Israel conducting some of its heaviest strikes in this war, hitting locations in central and southern Gaza. The Hamas-run health ministry saying more than 250 people have been killed in 24 hours, hundreds more injured. The World Health Organization describing the dire state of Gaza's healthcare systems.
Almost all of the hospital services have stopped functioning, either because the facilities themselves have been affected, because the staff have been forced to flee, because they run out of power or they run out of medical supplies.
Under the constant bombardment, dozens of Gazan children playing at this UN school, grasping onto a sense of normalcy. 10-year-old Rawan saying, we play to forget the pain we've experienced. Late today, an Israeli war cabinet minister said the next steps in the fight will also be powerful, deep and surprising, adding that the campaign will continue and will be expanded according to need. Whit?
Britt Clennett for us again tonight in Israel. Thank you. Next here, the race for the White House and an early legal victory for former President Donald Trump in a major battleground state. The Michigan State Supreme Court rejecting an effort to keep him off the state's primary ballot in 2024, declining to hear the case. Here's ABC's senior investigative correspondent, Aaron Katersky.
Tonight, a battleground state victory for former President Trump. The Michigan Supreme Court has decided Trump stays on the ballot, declining to take up a challenge by a liberal-leaning group seeking to declare Trump ineligible from running in the 2024 Republican primary based on his attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
If there's uncertainties about whether someone should have access to the ballot, you decide in favor of giving the voters the choice to and allow that person on the ballot.
Trump lauded the decision, writing on social media the Michigan Supreme Court strongly and rightfully turned aside what he called this pathetic gambit. There are similar challenges to Trump's eligibility in more than a dozen other states, including Oregon and in Maine, where the decision is up to the Secretary of State. Today, Trump's lawyers said Maine Secretary of State Shenna Bellows, a Democrat, has exhibited a personal bias and asked her to recuse herself. So far, only the Colorado Supreme Court has disqualified Trump, and he's expected to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. All of the challenges cite January 6th and are based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which disqualifies candidates from federal office if they engaged in insurrection after previously taking an oath to defend the Constitution, which Trump did during his inauguration.
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
In Michigan, a lower court said whether the 14th Amendment applies to Trump is up to the political parties that run the primary elections. A majority of the state Supreme Court justices said we are not persuaded that the questions presented should be reviewed by this court.
And so with the way the justices ruled avoid some of the thornier issues, like whether the 14th Amendment even applies to the presidency, something the Supreme Court may be asked to consider. Whit.
And Aaron, there's also news tonight about the federal case that charges Trump in connection with January 6th.
There is with the special counsel Jack Smith said today he's convinced Trump is going to try to inject politics into the proceeding, and so he asked the judge not to let him do it. He wants Trump's defense barred from making certain arguments, like Trump is being vindictively prosecuted at President Biden's direction. Whit?
Aaron Katersky with all of those developments today. Thank you. Next tonight, an alarming scene outside of the U.S. Capitol. A 23-year-old man carrying a machete and a knife was pacing back and forth on Tuesday. Capitol Police say an officer approached and drew his service weapon, ordering the man to put his hands up. The man complied and was safely taken into custody. No word yet on what he was doing in Washington, D.C., but authorities say there is no evidence that he was targeting members of Congress. There is still much more news ahead on World News Tonight this Wednesday. A new twist in Apple's battle to get its latest Apple Watch to consumers. Plus, the incredible white-knuckle landing caught on camera at one of the world's busiest airports. And the amazing story of survival. A driver pulled from the wreckage of his vehicle after nearly a week. How he made it out. Next tonight, a wild landing for passengers and crew on an American Airlines flight into London. The Boeing 777 could be seen drifting on its approach at Heathrow Airport. The crew struggling to bring the plane to a safe landing. Winds today gusting up to 40 miles per hour at the airport and in Greater London. A new front in the battle over artificial intelligence. The New York Times suing the creators of ChatGPT and other popular AI platforms over copyright issues. The paper says millions of articles published by the Times were used to train automated chatbots. In its lawsuit, the Times cited several instances where the chatbots were able to recite its reporting in a way that was nearly identical to what the paper had published without any credit to the Times. OpenAI says it's hoping to find a way to work with the Times. A victory for Apple as it battles to keep its newest Apple Watch on the market. A federal appeals court pausing the import ban on the latest model of the Apple Watch. That means the company can resume sales. While the court weighs allegations, the company infringed on the patent of a medical technology company. Apple says the watches are available today in stores and tomorrow on their website. When we come back, the amazing story of survival. A man waiting nearly a week for rescue after a car crash, how he made it out. And a little boy who just couldn't wait, what he did, and he was just trying to help. To the index now, an amazing story of survival. A man trapped for days in his crashed vehicle in an Indiana creek, rescued after being found by a father and son-in-law who were out scouting for fishing holes. It took first responders hours to get him out. 27-year-old Matt Reams said that he had been pinned for days, unable to move or reach his phone. He survived drinking rainwater. He's now recovering in a hospital where he thanked his rescuers. A passing to note tonight, television legend Tom Smothers has died. He's best known as one half of the Smothers brothers with sibling Dick Smothers and co-host of their at times controversial show in the late 1960s. The brothers tested the limits of television at the time with their style of comedy. Dick Smothers saying, "Our relationship was like a good marriage. The longer we were together, the more we loved and respected one another." Tom Smothers was 86. When we come back, the little boy who was just trying to help on Christmas morning. Finally tonight, the little boy who just couldn't wait and how his parents saved Christmas. The Rankin family in North Carolina got a Christmas surprise much earlier than expected. Their 3-year-old middle child waking his parents at 3 a.m.
Both of us went to sleep thinking everything was fine, everything was great. And then we were awoken with a request for scissors.
Where are the scissors?
Our 3-year-old had gone downstairs and he had opened every single present.
That's right. Their little toddler had opened everyone's presents hours before the sun came up on Christmas morning.
When I heard that noise, we thought, surely there's no way. I mean, he must have just found one and came back upstairs. And when I went downstairs, I could not believe it. Literally every little tiny thing except for the stockings were unwrapped.
The initial response was shock because it required a lot of work, almost like remaking the magic for them.
But the boy explaining it was all for a just cause.
He told us, he was like, well, I just was trying to make it less confusing. I wanted to open them so that everyone kind of understood what presents were for who.
Parents Scott and Katie frantically rewrapping all of the presents in time for a holiday they'll never forget.
Our 6-year-old had no idea. He could not care less that things were imperfect. He was just so happy that the magic had happened.
It was just like the wildest story we'll probably ever experience at Christmas that we will tell for years and years to come. I joked that we would like write it into his wedding speech for sure.
A story we'll all be remembering, no doubt about that. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Whit Johnson in New York. Hope to see you back here tomorrow. Good night.
Thank you for making World News Tonight with David Muir, America's most watched newscast.